Does anyone have any reflections they want to get started with? Okay, maybe I can get. Oh, sorry. Hala, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was just gonna say something.
Yeah.
No stress. Um, Maybe just to start off from the top of my head, maybe our reason to act or even do anything and not just go to the mountains and meditate and try to achieve the unity could be to experience what this probabilistic miracle that our life is has to offer in the first place, like all the experiences that we could um yeah, like experience all the ups and downs, everything in between.
Yeah. That makes sense. That there's a beauty, and even this is, even if you view it in the lens of like, okay, there is a personal God or whatever it may be, that there's this is kind of like this beautiful creation, and it's like something that is also worth just enjoying and engaging with through our day-to-day kind of activities and just being part of society.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That's one great way of looking at it. Does anybody else want to share anything?
I had a thought, not sure if going in the right, thinking in the right direction, but maybe you want to go out and like, you know, act,
Mhm.
be in the world, be in society, be around different people, that come from all over the place, share
Yeah.
your experiences, experience the world as one, learn from other people's experiences so that when you do meditate or do yoga, you have kind of like a sense of what you're striving for. Like, how do you know what you want unless you've gone out and experienced something? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, like when you become an adult, you're shaped from the experiences you've had growing up. So
Mhm.
it could kind of be the same, like I'm trying to achieve something, but I don't know what that is unless I've felt things.
Yeah. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. And that's sorry, when you're saying something?
No, I'm just saying that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'd say that's a very interesting thought as well, right? That like even like your day-to-day experiences kind of shed insight if you look at it the right way on the spiritual path. That you can be in the world and you can also be kind of like practicing that spiritual path. I actually had a very interesting discussion with a friend of mine who's also very, very spiritual and like a part of like one of the schools of thought. And he was kind of telling me he was joking around with one of his like kind of like the monks that he goes to, and he's like, you have it so easy in there where you're kind of like just like in this monastery, and there's no distraction, no temptation, nothing like that. You can just focus on what you need to. Like the real world is where you experience and you make these decisions outside of it. He was saying it as a joke, but I think it was there's an interesting amount of truth to that, where like you experience things outside of the monastery, and that's where you really can make decisions and like kind of like experience both the pain and the good side. So I guess that kind of ties in with both Manan, your point, and Hella, your point. Also, by the way, just to mention this, there isn't really a right answer with this. It's more of just like your perspective about it. So if anyone has anything else to share, by all means. Yeah, Chang, go ahead.
So I was thinking that like complete inaction that we're talking about is not really possible nor ideal for us because our basic survival, like eating and drinking,
Mhm.
that's actions required. And I was thinking that like what we were talking about last week. So is I was wondering if there's like a way to turn those the action that we're talking about as like part of the journey to achieve the unity with power Atman, like maybe the way that we're talking about like separating your expectation from your action and having that detachment, and maybe that can help explain like why don't we just hide in front of everything and don't do anything and just go meditate.
Yeah, that's you brought up a couple of really good points there. One being that like if we just like went off and meditated in the mountains, then it's like there's something that like at an individual level, there's certain needs that will just always be there, right? Like you need food, you need water, you need to survive in society. And if everyone kind of does that, then that kind of like disrupts that flow of society. So that's one point that was definitely there. And the second point being that like even through action itself, that there could be a way of just how you perceive your action or how you understand your action and why you do it, the intentions behind it. That could kind of like lead to spiritual growth. So it's kind of like in Buddhism they talk about the middle path, right? So not going to either extremes. So something along those lines. So yeah, those are all really good points. Does anyone else have anything they want to share? Okay, cool. Then let's continue. So one of the reasons that I thought of when actually let me just quickly do this. Share screen. Okay. Anyways, so one of the things with kind of if you're like kind of what I mentioned earlier, that if everyone kind of just left society, then society wouldn't function as it is. And that's not innately a good outcome for society. That actually is a more harmful outcome if we had everyone kind of just going off into the mountains and meditating. Like society would just be in complete disarray. And with respect to that, there needs to be some sort of way to establish balance between operating in the world and pursuing this unity. And that's where the concept of dharma comes in. So the dharma itself comes from the word dhar, which means to uphold. So the cosmic, it's kind of like the cosmic order which upholds the universe. And the way to think about it is it's like there's like kind of multiple components to it. You have this kind of like eternal thing which guides everyone, right? So it's like you could think of it as like your core morality, truth, nonviolence, compassion, and all these core characteristics. That's something that will apply to everyone regardless of circumstance and regardless of where you are at life. But then there are components that are very innately tied to your circumstances and where you are in society. Now, the interesting thing is, if you guys remember from class one, the modern connotation of the word Hinduism, which we kind of defined as being the schools of thought that take the Vedas to be the primary authority. Another word for that is Sanatan Dharma, which is universal, which defined as universal uphold. So it's kind of viewed as this like thing that upholds the entire universe. So the Sanatan Dharma is what kind of that essence of what I was talking about earlier. Now, we'll discuss this a little bit later and we'll see this in more depth. But even dharma can be ambiguous. And like there are a bunch of moral dilemmas where it kind of comes at play where like, should I do this? Should I not do this? And that's actually one of the main reasons that we have all these different Purans and stories and epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. They were all to kind of discuss a little bit more of these dilemmas that occur in Dharma. And that there's a specific technical term for it called Dharm Sankat. And that's another main reason why all these kind of stories were created. Actually, see, I put some speaker notes. So I want to make sure I covered everything. Yes. Okay, beautiful. So now talking more specifically about Sanatan Dharma versus Swadharma. So I'll put this in a little bit more brackets later on, but basically Sanatan Dharma is like your eternal universal principles that are governing cosmos. And these core principles, morality, all that's kind of applicable to everybody, what I was saying. Now, Swadharma is kind of like more of your personal duty. And there's a lot of different things that dictate that, right? It could be your role in society, it could be the natural skill sets you have, the stage of life that you're in, the circumstances that you have. For example, what type of family structure do you have? All these other things kind of come into play. And actually, let me see if there's any other speaker notes that I wanted to mention. I still need to figure out a little bit of this, a better way to present where I could see my speaker notes. So, oh yeah, so one thing I wanted to mention is at one point we kind of talked a little bit earlier about Varna and how like initially that eventually evolved into the caste system. So even Varna at one point was part of this whole thing of the Swadharma, but at the same time, the way that it's kind of Hinduism is evolving to be practiced now, um, what particular kind of like rung of society you are in does not make as much of a difference anymore. And to be very rational, it's something that shouldn't make much of a difference. So that's one thing. Now, something that's kind of interesting is sometimes your Swadharm kind of disagrees with your Sanatan Dharma in a way. And I'll give you an example. So the Bhagavad Gita, which is our core text, one of the core texts, you could consider it a summary of Hindu philosophy. It is written, and the context in which it is placed is that there is this warrior that is on the battlefield, and he is basically two sets of cousins are fighting each other. One are innately good, one are innately more evil, and they're fighting each other in this war. And right before the war, this one warrior on the good side kind of goes to the middle of the battlefield and sees all of his family on the other side and says that I don't want to fight anymore because I don't want to cause this harm to my relatives and all these other things. So that Sanatan Dharam concept of non-violence over here technically feels like it's not being fulfilled. But the representation of the Godhead Krishna tells Arjuna that you need to fulfill your duty. You need to fulfill your dharma, which is to fight. And that's where the Swadharma kind of takes a certain degree of, in one way, you could perceive it as your Swadharma is taking some sort of precedence over here. But I want to get your opinions on um why do you think that someone like the Supreme Godhead would have mentioned to Arjun in this situation to continue to fight if one of the core tenets of the religion or of our core moral principles is nonviolence? And again, I'll give you like 30 seconds to think about it, and then we can maybe discuss.
Before I form an opinion on it, I just wanted to understand
Sure.
what values come under Sanatana Dharma.
So I'd say they're more of like the core human values that are needed for society to exist, such as truth and nonviolence. And I'd say it's more of just like your core thing of basis of morality. Compassion is one of them as well. So it's like I don't want to say that it's a very defined list. It's more just like it's something that you would consider pretty intuitive in nature. You're essentially what guides your moral compass is one way of looking at it.
Got it. Okay.
So yeah, did anyone have any opinions on why do you think that I guess the Supreme Godhead told Arjun to fight in that instance rather than practice nonviolence?
I can try. I think I have some sort of answer.
Okay.
Uh, so the way I form an answer to that question is, I guess there's this duty of the cosmos, sorry, the left side dharma. Um, and in order to fulfill like peace or unity within the cosmos, everyone has to do their own duty in order to do that. So Arjun, being a warrior, has certain duties that he has to fulfill in
Hmm.
order to kind of help with the overarching outcome of peace and order within the universe. So I guess what it's kind of like Krishna saying, if you do this thing, it'll help bring order or balance to the cosmos, which is the ultimate goal, and that kind of supersedes everything, you know?
Hmm. So there's this role of like kind of his individual role or his swadharm playing in kind of the balance of the universe as an overall or the balance of society as an overall.
Exactly. Which
That's what you
is,
think.
yeah, I think the concept there, I think that's maybe Krishna saying that's more important than just you as one person. Let's
Yeah,
look at the universe as a whole. Yeah.
that's perfect. That's a great answer. Does anybody else have any other opinions, thoughts?
I do agree with what Manan just said. So I think it's more about how morality is subjective, and maybe it's okay to override some of these core principles given your situation and the result or outcome that it would give you with.
Hmm. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, and I think that's a great way of looking at it as well. Anybody else?
I think what Manan said is just really eye-opening because I never thought about it that way. I think the way that I had always seen it was almost as a personification of um, sort of a metaphor for us being confrontational in a way with our own, whether we want to call it shadows or our own trauma or our own limiting beliefs that we're trying to overcome. It's understanding, in this case, taking the decision and the initiative to fight versus the initiative of nonviolence could be, like I said, a metaphor for when do we actually address those things. It almost, I feel like, ties back to what we were just talking about a couple slides ago of like being in the society versus just retreating in isolation in the Himalayas. It's like knowing what the value is of each one. And so I feel like in this case, the value of, the example being the instruction is to fight is very much like being able to take those problems head on as opposed to just retreating, because at the end of the day, that's not really going to have any kind of purpose in terms of your own ascension towards moksha. So even on like a personal level, as opposed to just the overall societal order, I think there's a lot of value there in terms of knowing when to act in which way. I'm not sure if that entirely makes sense, but I almost see it connecting full circle.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And I think there's an element of symbolism here as well, right? In where the Gita is placed, and also in it being an internal battle as much as it is an external battle, or even more so perhaps. So I think your point is also very valid. But I think in both contexts, it actually morally and in terms of following your dharma does make sense. So it's like the actual contextualization in the battlefield, and then also the metaphorical representation as it being an internal battle. So I think both of those seem pretty valid to me. And I'll give you an example that I think Krishna mentions in one of the one of the I guess like in something about, so he talked about how there was a sage, and the sage promised that he would never say anything untruthful ever again. Now one day someone was running away from some robbers or some people that were trying to kill him, and he asked the sage to hide in this tree underneath where the sage, above where the sage was meditating. And so he goes and hides up in the tree, and eventually these robbers or killers come up to the sage and ask him, where did that person go? And now the sage had obviously a dilemma. Do you just stick with saying the truth at all times, which could potentially lead to the end of this guy's life? Or do you say a lie in the preservation of, I guess, like preventing this violence or this transgression from happening? And that's where I think it's really important to discern that, like, even the, like, kind of looking at society or looking at things for the greater good, I think is a very valid way of looking at things in this perspective. So for Arjun, it made sense that he needed to fight because if you look at the Kauravas, which I kind of described before as as kind of being innately more on the evil side, then the amount of violence that would technically cost society in the long term would potentially be worse. So even Arjuna acting is kind of in some way a non-violent act because it's something that's better for society in the long term. So, and I think Manan also just worded this really beautifully. So, yeah, I'd say that's where that kind of dilemma kind of lies. But as you said, because there's like all these moral things and there's all these question marks, that's why dharma isn't always so clearly defined. So now I'm going to talk about swadharma, which I mentioned before as a personal duty. And I'm going to give an example of it that's more, I guess, like tangible or related to our day-to-day lives. So in the Vedic way of thinking, there were four stages of life. And the first stage is the stage when you're a student, and that's what I think most of us have been for most of our lives, if not still in it right now, where the focus is on education, the development of morals, and preparing for future responsibilities. So it's essentially like your focus in this point is educating yourself, making yourself competent so that you can take care of yourself, um, developing solid morals so eventually you could pass those down to the next generation, and being prepared basically for taking on future responsibilities. Then that kind of switches over at around, and these are very ballpark ages, but say around 25 years old, where the emphasis then becomes that you need to start, it's about raising family, accumulating material wealth, contributing to society, and then even engaging in some degree of sense fulfillment as long as it aligns with your dharma. So this is kind of that stage of life where you're raising the next generation, passing some values down. Obviously, to your kids, you're going to be passing values, providing a sense of safety, right? So here's where the material wealth accumulation comes in. So even under this framework, the Vedic society isn't telling you that you need to just abandon everything and just meditate or that wealth is bad. If anything, it's encouraging you as long as it's by an ethical means, then contributing to society and sense fulfillment. So that's kind of like that householder stage of life. And then you have this retirement-esque stage of life. And this I think is very important as well, because this is where you need to start handing your responsibilities to the next generation and slowly start to withdraw from the worldly life. And I think this is very important because obviously it's a very difficult thing to do, to know when it's time to kind of transition over to the next generation. And I think there's like an entire books that can be written about this. But handing down those responsibilities, starting to wind down and starting to a certain degree detach yourself from society, from wealth, from all these other things, is this is that time because your peak contribution to society, from a wealth perspective, is kind of in that householder stage. So this is where you kind of pass the reins off to the next generation. And then the final stage of life, which is renunciation. And again, this is ballpark ages, but say after 75 years old is when you're kind of purely focused on spiritual liberation. So you're really just meditating, practicing spirituality, and all these other things, and also serving as a guide for others that want to follow this path. Now, the thing is, from starting from your student stage all the way to your renunciation stage, there's an increase in the amount of time and effort that you start to commit towards the spiritual path. So it's important that in this framework, it doesn't mean that you just like immediately leave society when you're a student and then you just like go meditate in the mountains and that's it. Unless that's what you are naturally inclined to and that's your swadharma, which is also possible, which is again another place where you see where the conundrums kind of lie. But this is kind of like a general framework for most people to live. And I think it's a pretty fair framework. It's something that I like am aspiring to abide by. So maybe something that's a little bit more practical is I will kind of have you guys think about it and see how you think that these apply to your life. And if you disagree with some of these, then by all means, feel free to share it. But I just want to know a little bit more about what you think the application of these are in your life. And yeah, feel free to think about it. So does anyone have any opinions, thoughts?
I guess these stages do reflect the kind of, if you think about a typical uh, time in your life and you think of the age you're at,
Hmm.
uh, it kind of falls under the buckets here. To me, I mean, it makes some sense. Like when I'm a student, from 0 to 25, or depending on, these are ballparks, but like you can be a student well beyond that or well before that as well. You can be a householder a little before or a little after, these years that the age range specifies. But I think in my life, at least, I've been a student until now, or at least until 2 years ago, I should say. Uh, it makes sense. Like I'm developing my morals and thinking about the kind of responsibilities I want to have and what kind of life I want to live later and what I want to learn, what interests me. And then in the householder stage, which I guess I'm slowly transitioning into, I am focusing more on the things that are, well, as it says here, right? Like raising family and material wealth accumulation. Not that I have a family or anything of my own yet, but these are things that I have to start thinking about and working towards. So I think it does reflect the natural progression of my life, and probably for a lot of people, it might be very, I don't know, kind of like a template.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that checks out. Thanks for sharing, Smith. Does anybody else have anything else they want to share? Okay, perfect. Then I think let's move on. So this is now when we're gonna start talking about karma. Now, karma is obviously like in the West, there's very much a perception of it where it's just like, oh, if I do something bad, then something bad's gonna happen to me. Or it's like, I'm pretty sure like I've heard the saying all the time, like karma is a bitch, et cetera, et cetera. But at its core, it's essentially just the law of cause and effect. And there's essentially three parts to this. There's the action itself. And here, even action is defined on the physical, the mental, the verbal plane. So it could be physical in the sense that maybe you went and you did something. It could be mental in the sense that you thought of something, or it could be verbal in the sense that you said something. And that's interesting because I think people don't oftentimes think about the mental aspect of things and even the concept of thought. But this kind of ties in with the Vedic viewpoint of wanting to kind of have a certain level of dominion over your mind. Now, the second part of it is consequences or phala, which is the outcome of your actions. Now, for something like a physical action, it's like very easily defined. But even from a mental perspective, the thought patterns that you have, they kind of grow and grow over time. They have impressions, and then they create further and further things in your life. It's kind of like, those sayings where it's like, um, you think, therefore you are. Or like just like this chain of thing that starts off with a thought and ends up with you just becoming something over a period of time. And the same thing with verbal. And then the third thing is your intention. So that's what is the very heavy, I'd say this has like a very heavy weight in determining the moral quality of your action. So what karma is essentially saying is that like the that you will have whatever action you take, you will have an equal effect, an equal opposite effect. So what determines what is an equal or opposite effect in this circumstance is a combination of intention, I guess, context, and moral quality of your action. So as an example, like let's say you donate to charity without any context, that's from a moral quality perspective, that's a great action. The context perspective as well, it's a great action. But if you're donating to charity with the intention of you want people to praise you, know more about you, or you're using it to kind of get this like get to this elevated point in a social hierarchy, so then you're doing it innately with very selfish intentions. So the karma that you'll get is essentially, I guess in a way you could define it as bad karma because your intention is off with that. Similarly, something that may be like technically without context a bad action, like for example, Arjuna fighting in a war, with the right context and intention could generate good karma because he's following his dharma. And I think in this, a lot of what determines like the equal and opposite effect is if you're following your dharma, essentially. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that a lot of people think that, oh, I should just generate a bunch of good karma, right? Which is, I 100% am saying that you should. But in terms of the perspective of freeing yourself and reaching that period of unity, in some way or form, actually both good and bad karma bind you. So I want you to think about this now, and I want to see what you think of why do you think that good and bad karma bind you? Starting, and you can obviously start with bad karma. Does anybody have anything they wanna share?
I think, I guess, my opinion on this is like the scales sort of balance over time, right? If you think about the kind of energy you give to people, or the intentions you have behind your actions and the things you do in your day-to-day life, they'll pay off in certain ways.
Mhm.
And, you know, that I guess may be related to this point of the phal and the karma that it brings. It's gonna shape your life in a certain way.
Mhm.
So I think it's a very natural thing that will happen. If you do certain things, you can expect certain outcomes. Uh, and I'm not too sure if you are bound necessarily by the things you've done. You can repent or like apologize for things you regret doing, or there's these things, but more or less, like, you know what to expect based on the things you do.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And I think to maybe shed more context, when I say bind, I mean more in the perspective of preventing you from necessarily self-actualizing or reaching that state of moksha. So more in that perspective, it's binding, as opposed to like, oh,
Mm,
like you're like sentenced to this because you've done this. It's not very much like that.
mhm.
It's more of like preventing you from reaching that
Gotcha.
self-actualization by just good karma alone.
Right.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other thoughts?
I don't have an opinion per se, but this was something that I used to think about a lot at a certain point about maybe morality and what is good and what is bad.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure if you watched The Good Place. Have you
Yes.
watched The Good
Uh,
Yeah. So do you remember that scene where she goes on about how the system on Earth is broken, and even trying to do a good thing will end up a person to do like 10 other bad things on the way, but they would never realize it. So
Yes.
that's something that I always think about, because I tend to spiral and I think about the minute things that are actions, or like the consequences of unintentional consequences of an action that you're making, and you might not even realize. It's like how I'm not sure, I think it's the Jains who mentioned that even when you're sweeping your floor or walking around, you kill multiple tiny insects or microorganisms, and that also leads to bad karma. And I
Yep.
think they take certain steps towards not doing it. So for me, the question I always think about is, it is something that I can dwell so much in depth into and overthink all my actions potentially, but also not, and I should not do that. So how do I even uh, sort of hoist my life around a certain moral compass?
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that example that you gave of the good place, and even the example that the Jains use is a very insightful example as well. So, first of all, actually, does anybody else have anything else they wanted to share? Cool. So maybe talking first of all about like the why both good and karma can bind you is first of all, like it's kind of obvious why bad karma can bind you, but it's more of like the negative actions themselves, they create suffering in the world. And in a sense, if it's like you do something that's morally wrong, it kind of reinforces it in your brain and like it strengthens your ego in a way and your attachment to the material world. So that in and of itself is kind of tying you to the material world more strongly. Then good or positive actions. So because there's like this positive actions lead to positive results, they also are, in a sense, kind of like you're experiencing these better states, right? Because of your actions. But even those better states could be tying in nature. So let me give you an example. So imagine that you are like you study really hard for this test and you do very well on this test. And that happens quite a few times. And it's kind of like your action was done with the right intention that you want to do well on this test. And you're like, it's like your role in society and everything else. And you do very well. But over a period of time, because you do really well and you start to like get good marks and get success and get into these good universities, you start developing an ego over that period of time because of the consequences of those actions themselves. So even that, in a sense, is kind of like tying you to this material reality. So that's one thing. And the second thing that you mentioned about like how like even good consequences can have all these bad effects. And I think the vice versa is true as well, right? These bad actions can have so many good effects as well. So I'll give you an example or like a story that I thought very strongly resonated with me. And I've told a lot of friends about this, so I'm sure some people here might have heard of it. But it's I think there's this koan or this story of a farmer. And so a farmer, one day his horse runs away. And the villagers kind of come up to him and say, like, oh, like that's so bad that this happened. And he's like, maybe, maybe not. But then the next day, the horse comes back with six other horses. And then the villagers come up to him and say, oh, this is so good that this happened to you. And he again responds, maybe, maybe not. Then the next day, his son is playing with the horses and he breaks his leg. And the villagers again, they do their thing. He says, maybe, maybe not. And then on the last day, someone from the army is coming to conscript people of that age group. But because his son's leg was broken, he could not be conscripted, and so he stayed home. And again, the villagers did their thing, and he said maybe, maybe not. So the whole thing is like, do we actually really understand if an action in the very long term perspective of things is innately good or bad? Or maybe it's just like this perspective of both. So that's kind of like the interesting dilemma here with karma. But then the question is if good karma is going to tie you and bad karma is also going to tie you, then how do you break free, right? And this kind of alludes a little bit to what Chang was talking about earlier, where the key then is to get to a point where not you're kind of in a sense generating no karma, right? But how do you generate no karma? And that's where selflessness comes in. So the path of karma yoga, which is one of the four main paths in the Gita that talks about how to reach enlightenment, is the path of selfless action. And this basically sums up everything about karma yoga, which is that you have the right to perform your duty, but not to the fruits of your actions. So in this circumstance, or just with any action that you take, that you want to perform your action and you're doing it with a certain intent, but or you can even do it with a certain expectation. But then when you attach yourself to the outcome of that action, then you're kind of making yourself vulnerable to the karma, the karmic consequences, whether that be good or bad. So the key kind of in all of this is not to renounce the action itself, not to let go of the action, not to just go meditate in the mountains, but to dedicate the action to your higher self or the universe. So you're kind of doing it out of this thing of service to society, to other people around you. And it may even be an action that innately is good for you. Like, for example, if you're accumulating money or material wealth based off of your dharma, that is the right thing to do in that point that you are in your life. But it's also good for society and for your higher self as a whole, as long as you don't attach yourself to that outcome. So it's like rather than being like, oh, I make this much money, I'm so good, XYZ, you just do it out of for the greatness out of the greatness in your heart or the love in your heart for society. And you realize that this is kind of like your way that you're contributing to society in some way or form. So actions essentially that are performed as selfless offerings transcend karmic consequences. And that's the whole path of karma yoga. So now let's just think about this really quickly, and this is going to be the end of this lecture. To think of some scenarios for karma yoga. So maybe if you can share these if you want to afterwards, but maybe if you can take down a pen or paper and just write down a scenario in your life where there's a certain action that you need to do and what it would be if you were doing it normally versus what that would look like if you were um doing it with this karma yoga, doing it while following karma yoga. So again, I'll give you 30 seconds or so to think about it, write it down, type it up, whatever it may be. Cool. Does anyone have any examples they want to share? Okay. Let me maybe start with one then, just to get us rolling. So I'll give a very, very simple example. Let's say I am washing my hands, right? And now I think about this quite a bit, but normally when I'm like washing my hands, I'm in this like crazy rush, right? That like, oh, I just need to get out of the bathroom. I need to do XYZ, blah, 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 blah. I have like all these things kind of going on in my mind, right? And I'm just like, I'm not really there when I'm like washing my hands. I'm like in 12 different places. So rather than that, imagine like washing my hands with the love and care that maybe if it was like I was holding a newborn baby's hands or like trying to wash their hands that I would do. Bringing that care into the action of washing my hands. And then while also kind of having this thing that like I want to make sure that people around me like when they shake my hands or they don't catch any infection or anything or that like my body itself is well protected and that I don't catch any infection or anything from having dirty hands. And like that's this kind of mentality that I'm going to bring while I'm doing some action as simple as washing my hands. So it's kind of interesting that it's like you're in this like pure kind of like this in this like very mindful state as you're washing your hands, but then you're also dedicating it in some way to society. And you're doing it out of like it's like an act of love doing it, even if it's something that you're just doing for yourself. It's like it's an act of love in that sense. So yeah, that's one example. Does anyone have any other examples?
I guess I have maybe an example, but I don't know if it qualifies. But
Okay.
yeah, because I'm not sure, maybe you're aware, I'm vegetarian
Hmm.
and I'm not like someone who goes out of my way to, advocate for animal rights or all this. But when I'm with friends, and especially recently when I was in Japan, given how unfriendly they are to vegetarians and vegans, because almost all the restaurants we went to were meat only restaurants. I would have to kind of isolate myself and go somewhere else to like an Indian restaurant somewhere uh, out of the way, or Uber Eats something to our, you know, hotel or something, instead of joining the group every night for dinner, because they were adamant to go to these omakase or meat only restaurants. And I'm not sure if like I came across as rude or something, or I had some intention in mind about the way I said it, but I was trying to tell my friends, hey, you know, this kind of like maybe preaching or whatever, like this industry is torturing animals and all this, and you guys are going to a lot of these places which are meat only, and maybe let's go to other ones that have also vegetarian options and
Mm,
things like that. But I guess I wasn't doing it out of the kindness to animals necessarily. I did
mm,
it out of my selfish reason that I'm vegetarian, so I want to maybe go to places that have options for me.
mm,
So while I do care about this animal welfare and am transitioning to veganism and try to advocate for that, I think the best thing I can do is teach them with love and respect that, hey, this is what happens. This is why I do it. You guys are free to follow whatever your beliefs are, but I can only educate you. But I think maybe what I said might have come across as something other than that.
mm. Got you. And that's an interesting dilemma over there. I think in like, and again, there's so many different ways of analyzing this as like a moral framework and all of that. But if you like, I think intentions generally aren't 100% pure, if that makes sense. Like it's very, very hard to have like the purest of intention. And I was thinking about this earlier. Like imagine like I bought a gift for someone and I do it out of like the love in my heart, right? And like afterwards, like they don't like the gift or they don't give the reaction that I'm looking for, that when I give them that gift, then I would feel hurt. And probably part of me would feel hurt because maybe part of me would feel hurt because like I wanted them to enjoy their gift and they didn't enjoy their gift, which is kind of selfless. But part of me may be like, oh damn, like I really wanted to be perceived in this light and I did it with like the purest of intentions and then now it's not happening. So that's not really like, so there's kind of like mixed intention over there, right? And I think in your situation it's a little bit of both, right? That like maybe that like your inconvenience may have pushed you over to that edge to having that discussion and communicating with them about it. But then there was a little bit of both, right? Like there was definitely some concern of animal rights and there's some concern of your own self as well. So I think that's like a an interesting like example of like that. And I think like to an extent there is definitely karma yoga there. And if you do it even out of like this sense of I think personal like a little bit of compassion for yourself because naturally you need to like your responsibility is also to have food, right? So I think it's reasonable for you to have that discussion. But again, maybe in the semantics of it, there may have been a better way to say it. So again, like I think that we could have a very long discussion about this, but like I think that that is an example where like over a time, if you have the intention of practicing karma yoga, that it will over time kind of purify your actions or purify the intentions behind your actions. And over practiced over a long period of time, you become more and more selfless.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, does anybody else have any other examples?
I have sorry, I think it's a pretty simple example, but it kind of defines the concept of karmic yoga that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
I had to think about it because I was, trying to understand it. But so at work a few months ago, a couple months ago, I was headed to a meeting. Like I got off my chair at my desk, I was heading to a meeting room, and as I'm crossing the hallway, I see not in my path, but I just see off to the side there was a like a push pin, like a thumbtack
Okay.
that was It was on the ground, but it had the needle facing up. Like if you stepped on it, the needle could go through you, for example. That's like the orientation. And I mean, I didn't really think twice about it, but I was like, oh, like this could hurt someone. So I just kind of picked it up and put it on the table and then went to my meeting. Um, and I completely forgot about it. Like I wasn't really thinking about it until now because I was trying to think of some examples for this, but I feel like that sums up karmic yoga in a way.
Yeah, definitely. It's you were doing it out of concern for other people and making sure that they didn't hurt themselves. And there wasn't really like a strong element of like, oh, I need to get like approval for this. And like,
No, yeah, and I wasn't like, oh, does someone see me do that? Act of service.
yeah,
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 I just kind of saw it and I was like, okay, let's just move back because it could injure someone. That's kind of it.
yeah. No, that's definitely an example of karma yoga as well. Anybody else want to share anything? Okay, cool. So I think for the last part, we'll do a meditation now. And we can talk a little bit more about karma yoga next time as well. If people have any questions, then by all means feel free to like put them in the chat or send me a message separately. More than happy to answer them.